Hey, welcome to the Common Good Podcast. It's Wednesday, February 9th. And, on Wednesdays of our podcast here, we like to talk about the role of faith in our society and what role it ought to play. And today's conversation with Dr. Berlinerblau, thank you, Berlinerblau, I'm going to get it. Jacques, I'm going to get it, is right up our wheelhouse, I was just saying, because as the title even says, we're talking about the need of secularism as a guardrail to protect democracy. And as a Christian pastor, I would argue secularism is the thing that Christians and other people of faith, as they participate in our civic life, have to be advocating for, because fundamentally what we have in the United States is a secular government and a secular society. And that raises all kinds of questions then about what the role of faith is in that world. And there's a lot of examples, as we've talked about. One is something that shows up as white Christian nationalism, and that certainly isn't the direction that we want to go. Jacques, you have written a book about this. You have written an entire Salon article. You are an expert on these things. This is, an area of deep interest to us, but also an area of profession for you. So thanks for being with us today, and thank you for this book that's so important. The role of, it's called, his new book's called Secularism, The Basics, and you're advocating for a secular society and that its role in protecting democracy.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right. So a lot of people hear secularism, and especially people of faith, and they think, well, I don't want to be secular. I want to be a person of good faith. So how can I have a society that is secular? And what do I do about it? Because secularism to a religious person sometimes feels like the opposite of what they want their faith to do. Can you share about how, when you're talking about secularism, there's some things you don't mean and some things that you do mean? Can you take us inside that?
Sure. I guess the first thing we've got to make very, very clear is secularism historically is not atheism. The two words, as my research shows, became kind of entangled in the mid-19th century in Victorian England. But prior to that, secularism had no connection whatsoever with the idea of non-belief. And I think this is where we should start, Doug. In fact, secularism emerges from a Christian discussion about Christian problematics led by Christian theologians. So I guess what I want to ask you as a pastor is, if somebody could convince the various Christian flocks, especially evangelical flocks across the country, that the very idea of secularism emerges from the writings of, let's say, Martin Luther. Wow, Martin Luther. I mean, that's a luminary in the canon, right?
Right. He gets a whole religion named after him.
Exactly. Would that make it easier for secularism to go down? So I'm going to ask you that question. The fact that secularism has religious roots, is that in any way something we could use to help ease the fears of so many religious communities that secularism is malign godlessness or some such thing?
Yeah, I would hope for, certainly would for Lutherans, I guess, and other people from that tradition. And I would imagine you can find people, as you probably have done, in many of the Christian traditions who would argue for this, because it was the vantage point, right? Like, in one way, you had religiously motivated peoples connected with secularly motivated peoples, trying to say, could we imagine a different kind of society that becomes the United States? Like, is that possible? And the thing they agreed on was, well, we're not going to have the government be our religion, and we're not going to have the government be our dictator of our faith. That's this sort of core principle of freedom to express religion or not religion. But then a lot of people don't know how to separate their personal belief in life from their civic life. We talk about that a lot in the work that we do at Vote Common Good and the work that we do on this podcast, trying to help people understand how you can have a personal motivation and a personal drive that's inseparable from why you believe the way you do about how our politics should be, but then not to transmit that into policies and into the demand of our government and our life together. And it feels to me like people want that to be the case. I mean, obviously there's some extremists who don't, and those extremists showed up at the Capitol on January 6th. Those extremists are running rallies around the country. They're led by people like Mike Flynn, the former general from the U.S. military. Actually, a lot of our U.S. military combines religion into the military in ways that a lot of us are deeply uncomfortable with. So that's the military is kind of a breeding ground for that. But outside of that, I think people want this. But I'll tell you, Professor, it's hard to figure out how we do it. I don't think we've done it well as a country, over these 230 some odd years that we've been about this, and it feels like we're doing it some days even worse now than ever before.
Sure. I think, well, the United States is a funny example. We got off on the wrong foot, and this is a very controversial thing to say, but the First Amendment, the religion clauses, anyhow, are deeply problematic from the point of view of secularism. Right? What is secularism? Let's start there. Right? Secularism, as I understand it, I refer to it as political secularism,
Hmm.
is the attempt by the state to regulate its own relations with religious
Hmm.
groups and to regulate the relations between religious groups. Right? It's like on
Hmm.
page 5 of my book, right? So that's what a political secularism is. There are various ways to do that. You could build a wall of separation, not working too well in the United States. You could try the French model, where the state rigorously controls everything that happens in terms of religious life, which is not preferred in the United States. There's the Indian model, where the state tries to help all religions equally. What I'm trying to say is there's
Hmm.
not just one way to perform a political secularism. There are a variety of ways to perform a political secularism. Our problem in the United States is we're saddled with this First Amendment, which is kind of cryptic. Those religion clauses, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. 16 words. 16 words, really? That's all we got? If you
Yeah.
look at France or India, their codes are huge. There are lots of
Hmm.
words about how religion and the government are supposed to interact for the greater good, for the good of both. So I'd say a starting problem in the United States is we don't quite know what Mr. Madison had in mind. And I think that's a
Hmm.
really important place to start. And then Mr. Jefferson got in a private letter to the Danbury Baptists, and he started
Yeah.
talking about a wall of separation. He went all Roger Williams, right, on our
Nice.
young republic. But that was a private letter to the Danbury Baptists where Mr. Jefferson spoke about separation of church and state. Notice that Mr. Madison didn't speak about
Hmm.
separation of church and state because we know he probably was not a fan of that framing, or neither that framing, neither that legal policy. So I want you to redirect me, because as a
Yeah.
professor, I can just blather on for. So I want you to kind of like say, well, why'd you say that, or why is that important? And I'll try to help us both make better sense of this for your excellent audience.
So if the Constitution doesn't demand a separation of church and state, um, what should the relationship between religion and our government be? What does the Constitution or the original founding notions demand of us? What should it be if it's not a wall?
The scholars tell us that opinions varied, and I think that
Hmm.
is correct. That where George Washington stood is not where Thomas Jefferson stood. So Jefferson and Madison are outliers, by the way.
Uh,
They're taking the most radical edge of the European Enlightenment. They're reading John Locke, right? But they're standing in places that, let's say, Washington or even Ben Franklin or Hamilton, they're not in the same space in terms of their thinking about the proper role of
hmm.
religion in American public life. So we have a very muddled foundation. We have very few words to go by. And another important issue is basically everyone is white and Protestant at the time that they're pondering this through, right? There are very few Catholics who are discriminated against, very few Jews. All persons of African ancestry are enslaved, or most are, and completely denied their civil rights, and women can't vote, right? So when we try to build
Hmm.
a coherent secularism from our founding documents, I
Okay.
think we are greatly, greatly hamstrung by those factors.
Okay, so if we can't get to call for a secular society clearly from the founding documents and some shared opinion, of the founders, where should we go? How do we find that?
Well, we do have constitutionally, we have a judiciary, right? And
Hmm.
our judicial apparatus is entrusted with interpreting the Constitution. And I would hope, I'm not an originalist at all, neither as a biblical scholar nor as a political scientist. I am not an originalist. I would hope we understand that times change, people change, and the courts have to reflect the changes within the Democratic majority. So where do we look? We can look to the 14th Amendment. I often play this little game where I say, I think the 14th Amendment is more helpful to secularists than the First Amendment. So the 14th quashes the first. Why? Because the 14th Amendment speaks about equal rights, equal protection under the law for all. Right? I think that's a major advance on the muddled First Amendment. I would also add our courts mid-century, in a series of landmark Supreme Court decisions, did argue that the original intent of the founders was for separation of church and state. And Justice Hugo Black was a major advocate of that. So there's this little interval from 1947 to 1985 where the United States Supreme Court, right, the judiciaries, the state legislature, all believe that we must have a separation of church and state. And I think it was okay, right? I think things worked pretty well in those 40 years. I think there was religious peace. There were some problems, right? And then evangelical Christians and traditionalist Roman Catholics, conservative evangelical Christians and traditionalist Roman Catholics, got back in the game in the late 60s and 70s. And within 20 years, they completely dismantled the wall brick by brick. And what a lot of Americans don't understand is the courts don't think in terms of the wall anymore. That's not part of the way our Supreme Court thinks about the proper relationship between religion and the government.
Is it fair to say that in the current situation, the courts are tending to think more about how to protect religion from the government, that religious freedom is the concern? And I hear a lot of conservatives argue this, that if you read the First Amendment the way they do, they would say the notion here was to protect religion from government overreach. And that's what the courts are now doing. Is that a safe way to say it, that secularism is not the goal of the courts? The goal of the courts are to protect religious expression from being squashed by government?
Secularism is pro-religious freedom, by the way, right? As you know, I mean, it's built on the idea that religious freedom is essential, but it doesn't make religious freedom the supreme right, right? What does secularism warn? And this is, we're really getting to the marrow here, Doug, thank you. Secularism argues that what's even more important than religious freedom is public order. Because if there isn't peace, if religious groups are disemboweling one another, as they did in the 17th century, this is key, no one gets to God. Right? So what a theorist like John Locke, the great Enlightenment political philosopher, was trying to calibrate is he was trying to grant as much religious freedom as possible and have a contravening force, which would be the state, which would at a certain point say, you know what, you can't do that one particular ritual you like to do because it's so going to upset that other group that we're going to have an urban riot and we're going to have cadavers in the streets. Basically, I'm describing the 17th century, right? So looking back at the 17th century, what John Locke understood is Christians could not be Christians because they were so busy exercising their religious freedom at the expense of one another. To me, that's the drivetrain of political secularism, balancing religious freedom with the need for order. That order is tranquility, so people can worship and people can venerate their God as they see fit.
All right. So in our current society, this stuff comes up, right? The people who own a business called Hobby Lobby say, hey, as religious people who own this business, we don't want to have to follow the mandate of health insurance if health insurance has to provide reimbursement for contraception because we don't think that people should use contraception. And we think it's a moral problem and rooted in our religion. And so the government can't make us pay for our employees' contraception, right? The Hobby Lobby case, as it gets sort of talked about. That found a hearing with the Supreme Court where it feels to me, and you would know better, that 30 years ago or 40 years ago, there was no way that kind of argument was gonna last. That the idea that a private company gets to pick and choose based on its religion which parts of the law it wants to follow. And then you just extend that forward into bakers making cakes for gay weddings. And, here we go,
Clerks,
right? Just sort of down the
clerks
road.
denying marriage licenses to gay couples, right?
Yeah, a clerk saying, "Well, I can't be forced to do my job because I have a religious, call," or someone now saying, "I get a religious exemption from the vaccine, a public health demand, but religious convictions mean that I don't have to behave the way others do." How does all of that fit into a secular society? Because it sounds like what you're arguing is, no, that's exactly what a secular society should do, is to free people up. But it doesn't feel like that's really what your conclusions are going to be.
Well, a secular society, as I said, wants to grant as much religious freedom as possible up to the point that the rights of other citizens are infringed and or the safety of the state is threatened.
Hmm.
So that's a true secularism, right? What we have in
Got
the
it.
United States is we have these maximal arguments on behalf of religious freedom, that religious freedom is the first freedom, right? It
Yeah.
trumps all other freedoms. And I don't know of any society that could exist for a very long time if that rule were operative, at least any multicultural society where you have more than one or two or three
Yeah.
religious groups. So it's one thing that I do want to point out is the genius. You said something really important. 40 years ago, this was unthinkable, these types of arguments, right? Who developed these arguments? These are our Christian friends who spent a lot of time getting their best and brightest into basements, thinking with yellow legal pads, and they developed strategies, they tested things out, and now we're seeing it come to fruition on a variety of levels, even in terms of the types of people that are being appointed to the United States Supreme Court. One question I ask, rather impolitely, is where were secularists in the last 40 years? Right? They fell asleep at the wheel. Right? Something clearly went wrong for American secularism and its theorists, that they didn't understand how to inoculate themselves against what we're seeing now, or they didn't even know that it was coming. So I'm deeply disturbed by that.
Yeah.
But what this calls for is a very different legal strategy. I mean, this is what it comes. Secularism is a barrister's paradise. It comes down to the minutiae of the law, right? People can talk about it. It's really about what happens in case law. And either secularists find strategies that can repulse this maximalist conception of religious freedom, or we're in for January 6th is going to look like I don't know, nursery school, right? Unless we get control of these maximalist religious freedom arguments.
Yeah, and I do want to go down that route with you for a bit here in a minute, but I want to follow up on this notion that I've had for a while, that I could say it in two ways. One is that secularism is not a very good organizing principle, or better said, that religion is a really good organizing principle. And so you end up with a benefit on the religious side and with a deficit on the secular side. Do you think that's true in your experience? Do you are around a different
Oh,
crowd of
true.
people, maybe?
In fact, the final chapter of this book is called "Love the Referee?" Question mark. Secularism is like a referee. When you watch a great sports match, a football game or a soccer game, how you only comment on the officiating if it's bad. If the officiating is good, right, you've just enjoyed a great game. So secularism isn't a movement per se.
Yeah.
It's a way of regulating relationships that doesn't have that many natural adherents. It doesn't have a constituency. But you know who always likes secularism, Doug? Religious minorities
Yeah.
love themselves. It doesn't matter where they are, right? So Muslims in the United States love secularism, don't like it that much in Pakistan, right? Jews in the United States love secularism, don't like it that much in
Yeah.
Israel, right? For whenever you're in the religious minority, you're pro-secular. You know who else loves secularism, and we should mention them? Non-believers, the nuns, the religiously
Yeah.
unaffiliated, who don't want to live by anybody else's creed. Baptists traditionally were huge doctrinal fans of
Hmm.
secularism. The Southern Baptist Convention went one way about 30, 40 years ago, but there still are those hardcore Baptists that agree with most of the precepts which I articulated
Yeah,
previously.
absolutely. In fact, we do a lot of work with the Baptist Joint Commission, which is a Baptist organizing group that does this, and we put out some curriculum for churches and religious leaders on how to combat Christian nationalism via the approach of secularism as the organizing principle. All right, so every time we do one of these live streams and podcasts, and 5 days a week, somebody will pop into the chat. I'm sure they'll pop up here and just write separation of church and state. You religious people need to stay out. They're making a secular argument, but their argument is protect the government from religious people, protect all the rest of us from religious people, and let's have non-religious orientation. That's clearly not what you're saying. But so you want to say something about that, and then I have a follow-up question to that.
I think the problem, I mean, I'm not against separation. It's just not working right now. The courts are not receptive to it.
I see.
I find any metaphor that has a wall in it, by the way.
Thank
just
you.
went through 4 years of walls, right?
Yes.
I don't know how I'm feeling about walls. I know that Mr. Madison wasn't crazy. He spoke about lines of separation in a pointed reference to Mr. Jefferson's walls. I'd be cautious with walls. It's not that I'm against separation. I think the problem is people have assumed separation is a one-on-one synonym for secularism. There are other forms of secularism, and maybe given the rut we're in, all of us in the United States who are secularists, religious minorities, religious moderates, non-believers, maybe we should explore other legal tactics and pathways. That's my concern with separationism. Separationism has been in the public, let's say, in the judicial public consciousness for 80 years. To me, it looks graying and faded and old. It doesn't look like it can deal with all this newfangled conservative Christian technology, legal technology. I think we need an infusion of jurists who, as I said, think more about the 14th Amendment than the First Amendment, because fundamental equality is being threatened. So, no, I'm not against separation. I just feel we need a refresh and we need to rethink.
Yeah, look, being anti-wall, I think, is a great thing. I sort of, harken back to the one thing I like to remember from Ronald Reagan, which was tear down this wall, not build a new one, and all the rest of it. But in fact, we've just a little tangent. We spent a lot of time around immigration and just did a cross-country bicycle ride from San Diego to St. Augustine, Florida, the majority of it along the U.S.-Mexico border, along the wall, try to tell the story of the implication of these walls because they're really bad. But I heard some statistic, which I'll get the numbers wrong, but I think the idea will be right, that when Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, there were like 11 border walls in the world. And now there's like 160 or 180. Like, we have seen a proliferation of walling off, and it's happening globally and in our society. So I think you're right. There's something afoot. But here's my other question, which is, all of the Supreme Court justices except Amy Coney Barrett, who went to Notre Dame, which is not exactly your bastion of liberal, thought. They all come from the Ivy League schools. So when religious people saw a problem with the judicial branch, they started law schools. And like you say, they started meeting in basements, and they started training up people and recruiting people to go not to seminary, but to go to law school in order to make religion the predominant expression of Christian religion, the predominant expression in North America. Like, they just went to law schools and started them, right? Liberty University started law schools, and they're all over these. But it's actually people on our Supreme Court from Harvard and Yale and the Ivy Leagues. So you being a professor at Georgetown, like, what's going on there? Because you can't blame like the sectarian colleges and universities and law schools for this. It's coming out of the Ivy Leagues, even more so.
I'll meet you halfway. A lot of the hot action that goes on in the routing of secularism happens at the state level. And something that secularists missed and Christian activists understood in the aughts in particular was she or he who controls the state house controls a lot more than just the state house. So they took control of the state house. I bet you those lawyers that were trained at Liberty University or Pat Robertson's University, where they had, by the way, Liberty University had a full-scale replica of the Supreme Court on its campus. Right? They weren't messing around, right? They were training people to argue in front of the highest court of the land. So I think, sure, we have these elite jurists from the elite schools, but my guess is if we looked at Harvard, Yale, I mean, those are the two big ones, right?
Yeah.
You, they're probably outliers, right?
Hmm.
Those schools are probably much more liberal in terms of the types of people they train and graduate than the ones who are hand selected and even groomed to sit on the United States Supreme Court. So I don't know if it's a problem of the elite institutions.
Okay.
I think we're looking at the genius and the cunning of the Christian right. I mean, what did secularists used to say about the Christian right? They were a bunch of yahoos, living in the Ozarks, so they couldn't
Right.
speak the English language, and they outfoxed and out hustled and out generaled the liberal elites across 30, 40 years. And that's going to need to change if we're going to have a secular America.
Um, what would a secular America look like to your average person if 40, we tend to talk a lot about what the next 40 years will look like because people 40 years ago were asking that question and we can see what it looks like now, right? There was an imagination born in the 1980s. It's alive and well. So if one asks themselves as we do, what will the United States look like in 2062? What would you imagine a secular society look like that it doesn't look like now? That's not currently here. Would there be less religion? Would there be more secular institutions? Like how do you see it?
There'd be less conservative Christian worldview. There could be as much religion, right? But I mean, there are a lot of religions out there, right? So
That's right.
if you look at the laws in Texas, right, the abortion laws, anti-abortion laws, those reflect one religious understanding of when life begins. But there are other religious understandings of when life begins, right? So, Judaism has a completely different understanding about the ethics of abortion, right? So what's happening in Texas is a
Hmm.
uniquely conservative Christian understanding about the emergence of life is being imposed on all women in the state, be they Jewish, be they Muslim, be they Hindu, be they non-believers, right? So what secularism doesn't want, and this is complicated, right? Secularism doesn't want one particular religion's approach to the world to dominate
Hmm.
every other person's life. That's one, but we have this growing category of the nuns. And secularism was born in a world where there were no atheists and there were no agnostics, and most people were religiously affiliated, right? Up to 30% of our country now is non religiously affiliated, right? The minority of that group are atheists and agnostics.
Yeah.
But secularism is going to have to think this one through. It wasn't built to think through non believers and the non religious. It was built to think through government and religion, the great Augustinian binary, right? Now what? You have a trinary, right? You have three things go. You have government, you have religious citizens who are diverse, and then you have these nuns, right? The religiously unaffiliated. So I don't know what a secular society is going to look like in 2062, but we need incredible intellectual firepower to
Yeah.
start configuring it.
Yeah, because I think there's an assumption that because of the First Amendment and maybe even the 14th Amendment, but just because the way the Constitution is, that it's going to borrow this metaphor of, the arc of history is long but bends towards justice. Like, hey, it's ultimately all going to go this way because it kind of has to, because that's how it's set up, and we'll have some backward steps along the way, but it's a two-step forward, one-step back world that we live in. Are you suggesting that it's not necessarily the case, that never has been clear that we would have had a secular society? And
Who would
was there a time in America where it was more secular, and you think, let's make America secular again? Can you point to an again
we
moment?
had 1947 to, when John F. Kennedy said, I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute. I think it was September 17th, 1960. Houston Ministerial Baptist Association. Yeah, we had a functioning separationist secularism in the United States. It was there.
Hmm.
Then Justice Rehnquist shut the party down in 1985 in the Jaffrey case, where he said the wall metaphor is bad history, bad metaphor, and it should be explicitly abandoned. So there were better iterations of
Hmm.
secularism in the United States.
But wasn't that the same period where like churches were doing better than they are now? I mean, I spent a lot of time in the church world, and while
Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't that fascinating, right? Yeah,
That's right. I
because
see
we
where you're
know,
going. Yeah.
you know where I'm going, right? We know that a lot of people in the pews don't like the politics, right? They come for the healing, they come for the
Yeah.
spiritual refreshment, for the therapeutic joy of being in community. They're not coming for culture war scrums, which is what they're getting. And all the research
Mm.
I've looked at suggests the growing religiously unaffiliated are completely disenchanted with the politicization of usually Christian churches. Right? That's where the bulk of these folks are coming from, right? So Christianity is doing itself no favors long term by pursuing this aggressive political agenda. That's not what church should be. But you nailed it right there, Doug. Right? Church
Mm.
attendance was more stable. People, there was higher weekly church attendance. There was higher dues paying membership at the
Yeah.
time. And now the Christian churches in the United States hemorrhaging,
Yeah.
are hemorrhaging congregants, right? There's a reason for that.
And in that same period, a lot of us who sort of track back and say um, there was a there were some cultural decisions and cultural language shifts. We point to that period and say things like, our money didn't used to say "In God We Trust." We didn't used to say the Pledge of Allegiance and then baptize in a religious language. Like that also all changed in this same period of time that you're describing, right? The communist fear take over, and we're not going to be good enough, and maybe the communist Russia is going to win out. Like that anti-communist, therefore anti-God, meaning secularism argument is what fueled
Exactly.
this huge movement. So if that was the period that you're saying uh, it was going well, it also looked like the period. It looks like the period that laid the groundwork for people to just believe that we should be baptizing all manner of things and launching presidential prayer breakfasts, and that just happened this last week. And all of these things are like they root back to that period of time.
Yeah, they do, and there have been innovations. Like I remember in professional sports, there was a hard wall, right, between being religious or showing your religiosity. But I remember that first football game between the Giants and the San Francisco 49ers, where they told the NFL they were going to pray at midfield. And they did, right? But to me, what's funny about that is if you look at the famous iconic image, Doug, there are a group of players praying at midfield, and way off in the corner, that safety for the 49ers, Ronnie Lott, is punching a member of the New York Giants in the face because down the field there was a fight. Ain't that America? Right? But
That's
so much has
perfect.
seeped into our culture that was simply unthinkable 30, 40 years ago, right? Religion is seeping in, seeping in, seeping in. Careful what you wish for. I always tell my Christian friends, careful what you wish for. Because at some point, some of the old animosities are going to come to the fore. I mean, how long can evangelical Christians and Roman Catholics hold hands on every imaginable social issue? There are clear disagreements there. So right now, strategically, there's a partnership. How long can Mormons and evangelicals make common cause on everything? They can't, and they shouldn't. Right? There's no reason. But politically, they're aligned with one another.
Right.
But what's the next step once those groups come to power?
Well, I think you're right, and I think that if the Supreme Court makes drastic changes to Roe versus Wade, that will do two things, in my view. It will push the argument from the federal judiciary into the state legislatures. So now you're going to have every state making its own rules, and all of that animosity that's been at the federal level is going to move into the states, which is going to be really just make state politics very difficult. Because most people who are state legislators, it's a part-time role, right? They do something else. They're not professionals. They're going to get hit with lobbyists at a professional grade. That's going to make things very hard. But I think it's also going to take the wind out of an awful lot of the joint commitment that evangelicals and conservative Catholics have had around determining when life should be granted to a fetus. That's been
Or
the glue that's been holding that consortium together for the last 40 years.
I mean, they're natural fissures, right? Death penalty is going to be a big problem. And then once Mormons and evangelicals find one another together, jointly ruling, co-rulership, there are going to be problems there. They're going to be
Yeah.
huge. And then everyone's going to be pining for secularism. That's honestly what I feel like. Remember the good old days where we didn't have, I hate to religious violence in the streets, because that's the next stage. 20, 30 years down the road, yeah, and if it comes down to a state by state basis, and Utah proclaims itself a Mormon state, what would stop it from doing so? And South Carolina proclaims itself a Southern Baptist state. There are
Mm.
going to be problems. All right, we're going to go right back to the 17th century.
Yeah, and look, the things that happened on January 6th, a lot of us, from the Christian perspective, watched that and listened to the words and to the dialect and recognized our own people in that, and will remind others that January 6th was a day of organizing, but so was January 5th, which is when religious people, Christian religious people, especially conservative Christians, gathered together on what they call the Jericho March.
Right?
So on that Tuesday, they marched around the Capitol building in a prayer, borrowing from the Jewish tradition of asking for the walls to come collapsing down. So that whole thing was funded and fueled by a Christian religious imagination to bring down the strictures of the government, not just to re-elect or to keep Trump in office. That was the tool that they needed to have in place, but for a larger religious agenda that still is going on. And so when we get nervous about, the guardrails coming, collapsing, like watching the gates or the barricades collapse is like watching the guardrails collapse. It's like it's like the visual version of that. So what do we do? Okay, if we can't go as far as 2062, what can people who want to be engaged in this, people who identify their faith as important in their life, those who don't, what can we do and be about here? And obviously your book is meant to be, it's meant to be a helpful piece on some people getting back to what the basics of secularism is. If it's not anti-God, not anti-religion, not atheism, but something more traditional to the American experience of this, what can people do? What do you advise?
Well, we're speaking to a mostly Christian audience. I think a lot of pastors have to take their congregations back to Romans 13, right? Obedience to the governing authority. That's not the only scripture, which makes this radical Christian claim, right? We're not the power people. That's not our thing, right? We don't want to govern. We just want to be just and loving and faithful, right? And help our fellows, right? And we wait for the world to come. So I think there's a lot of pastoral work that can be done on the grassroots level of going back to original scriptures and pointing out that these Jericho marches are something frightfully opposed to some sections of Christian scripture. And within the scriptures themselves, there are arrows that point to the Christian value of secular governance.
Is there anywhere in the world where you've seen a version of secularism that looks sort of hopeful for what the American experience could look like, or are we too peculiar in this country as a country and a government to really borrow from another place?
Strangely, Uruguay. Uruguay, yeah, the more you read about Uruguay, the more fascinating it becomes. I'm not an expert on Uruguay, but I just couldn't believe what I was reading about the level of religious peace, right? I know this is an unpopular opinion, but I'm from there. So France, when I go to synagogue in France, regrettably, there's only one thing. There are now armed security guards outside, right? Because it's very dangerous right now because of various problems. But I think if you follow this one French rule about not bringing your religion into a public space, which is very hard for me. I understand that, right? But from the moment you agree to do that, there is a tremendous degree of freedom of conscience and free exercise. They're not the same thing. That is granted to religious French people. It could be better, all right? There are problems vis-a-vis the Muslim community. I understand that France is underperforming. But I've always felt that if you did French laïcité correctly, right, and laïcité is a version of secularism where the government really controls religion, but it acknowledges there must be freedom of conscience, there must be free exercise, and there must be equality. I think that can work. France of late hasn't been a role model. I want to be the first one to say that, right? But a version of laïcité where it's unambiguously clear the government is the government, full stop, and there are hard lines that religion cannot cross, can work if it's done judiciously. And then there's secular disasters. I'm the first to tell you. I mean, USSR, disaster. People's Republic of China, disaster. Ba'athist Syria, disaster. I'm not a cheerleader for secularism. All right? There's certain forms of political secularism which I feel are necessary, but we must recognize
Mm.
many of them have failed. They've crashed and burned. So let's be fair.
What when you describe in maybe in Uruguay or in France, not bringing religion into the public space, what does that mean? What does public space? Uh,
Like outside. I mean, that's the fun. I know more about France than Uruguay. Like you can wear your tiny little cross, right? But don't bring one of those 40-foot jobs that they had over the January 6th insurrection. Even culturally, the French don't like to talk about religion
yeah,
on their news show, right? It's just keep it to yourself, enjoy, knock yourself out, right? But it's something that's very personal and is meant to be kept under wraps. And that's very hard for Americans. I understand, right? That's really, really hard for Americans. But it worked for a long time. It worked, right? And now it's not working. That we have
yeah,
to
and it's
be.
kind of an expression that you hear. We do a lot of conversations with political candidates, Democratic candidates, on how to connect with religious people. And curiously, one of the things we say to them is, look, you have to find a way to connect with these voters that's authentic. And for a lot of Democrats, the sort of John Kerry or John Kennedy approach to being, at the highest level is to say, my faith is private. It's not going to have anything to do with what else I do. Like, this is between me and my God and my doctor, right? It's just going to stay away from all the rest of our public life. That hasn't gone well in America,
That's what Obama understood. Obama blew that up, right? We
Yes.
worship an awesome God in the blue states, right? So, and then in his The Audacity of Hope, he took some, I think, cheap shots at secularism, the S word, right? He took it out. Okay. I think Democrats have to go to that 14th Amendment, and they've got to understand who they're speaking to. They are speaking to a lot of mainline Protestants, right? Mainline
Mhm.
Christians. They are speaking to a lot of liberal Catholics. They are speaking to a lot of religious minorities, be they Jews or Muslims. And I believe those folks are less interested in the personal faith stories of these candidates than
Yes.
learning precisely how these candidates' policies will prevent a Texas from occurring again, right? That's what they
That's
want to
right.
hear. And I don't think the
Yeah.
Democratic Party has really shown good leadership on the issue of church state. Really, it's been a failure since about 2008 forward. It was the
Yeah.
values vote when they lost in 2004, and everyone was like, "Oh, you lost because of the values voters," right?
Yeah.
They went into panic mode, and they went into a type of reversal, which I don't think did well for the party. I don't think it was good for the Democrats, but maybe I'm
Yeah. I would read it the same. I would very similarly that's, um, boy, there was something in there I was thinking about how this had gone in the past, and I was going to ask you about it. All right. So if people pick up your book, what kinds of people benefit from your book? Are you finding? Is it group discussion? Is it individual rethinking? Is it like a mind bender for people that are like, wow,
Christians.
that spun my head around?
Christians cannot believe the Christian genealogy of secularism. It just stuns them, right? That this is in their own scriptures. We talked about pastoral work. I mean, somebody's going to have to lead a hermeneutic circle with their congregants and say, well, Berlinerblau is either he's insane or he's right. And if he's right, maybe thinking about secularism is a Christian uh, is a Christian virtue. Others who I find journalists are reading it because there's tremendous confusion around the word secularism.
Yeah.
So people are assuming it's atheism, and I've been saying this for years. That's just bad for atheism and bad for secularism, right? They overlap, right? But they're not the same thing, right? Secularism as a political philosophy is not atheistic. It's kind of agnostic in a way, right? It kind of says all religions are good, right? As
Yeah.
long as you're lawful and obey the rules, have at it. And all non-religions are good as long as you're lawful and obey the rules, have at it. It's that referee function, right, that secularism finds itself in. So those are the constituencies. A lot of LGBTQ folk Find the book
Yeah.
interesting. I reference LGBTQ issues pretty consistently because I'm interested by them myself.
Why do they find it? Why is secularism so helpful for people who are in the LGBTQ communities or care about the LGBTQ communities?
Because secularism is anti-bully, or at least it should be when it works, right? In the USSR, it was not anti-bully; it was full-on bully, right? So the type of secularism that interests me is super attuned to the pain of small religious groups, let's say Anabaptists, for example, in like the 16th
Yeah,
century, right? It's very attuned to sexual minorities. It's very attuned to heretics, right? So I personally have
yeah.
an emotional connection to these types of folks. So this type of secularism that
Okay.
I'm reconstructing thinks about those folks, right, and how
Right.
they must feel, right? I was thinking of this story that Mr. Madison was in a prison one day and he heard a Baptist who had been imprisoned by the Anglican powers that be. And the dude was just howling. I mean, howling. And it shook Mr. Madison to his foundations, right? He
Mm.
thought about that juxtaposition of massive state power, this poor Baptist
Yeah.
dissenter in a prison, screaming at the top of his lungs. To me, that is a secular moment right there. I want
Right.
Americans to have more secular moments, Doug.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. And it's funny as somebody who orients my Christianity around Jesus's teaching. That's sort of central to it, right? The least of these, the lost coin, the one sheep that's gotten away, the one that doesn't fit, that you can't orient the Jesus narrative that doesn't lead you to what I think you're describing as a secularism, right? When he says stuff about the Samaritans and that they're actually the good people, not the bad people as you say that they are. And in my Father's world, there's, sheep from many other pastures. Like all of that is trying to say that the religions can and do sometimes create a pain that we're called to alleviate, not called to double down on. So yeah, and that's the curious part. I think, a lot of people who take their faith more seriously actually lean towards secularism. Even conservative Christians do. In all honesty, it's these people for whom their religious identity is not very well funded or very well supported, but it's a very deep identity, and they don't.
I love what
It's
you're doing. I mean, we are finding a real synergy, right? I think I've articulated every imaginable thing about secularism except for that, right?
yeah,
That within Christianity, there is this love for the underdog, right? There is
yeah,
this love for the person, the prostitute, right? That the person who is disgraced or spat upon, right? Or calumniated.
right,
And that is a clear link between secularism, which is born of Christianity, and the goals of political secularism today. Thank you,
yeah.
Doug.
I
Really
mean,
is
honestly, not to get too preachy here because it's only a Wednesday, but the crucifixion narrative, as it's told in all four Gospels, shows the power of a religious group using the government to truly execute its purposes. And you're supposed to look at that and say to yourself, that system, it's going to kill the good guy. I promise you, that's the story, right? That the innocent one, what did this man ever do? Like all of that is trying to tell that story that we just see repeated over and over, and that you've said that, watch out for what you ask for. It's famous that Trump is sort of the great example of not needing to be like the adherents to a religion to get their support.
Mm,
It's not that he was anything like evangelicals. He just said, well, I like you and I'm going to give you what you want. It's very, very famous now that he has said to his advisors and others, give the religious Christians what they want. They want Mike Pence. I'll pick Mike Pence. They want evangelicals to be in positions of power. We'll give you Mike Pompeo. We'll give you the Secretary of Education. We'll give you a Mike Flynn. Like he surrounded himself. We'll give you Steve Bannon, who was actually a hyper conservative Catholic that's
mm,
attacking the Catholic Church for being too secular. That's his guy. So the subtext was, your people, you're going to get what you want. That kind of devil, it's almost like the religious community heard the temptations narrative, from the Gospels and said, well, that's a deal I would take. I'll take that deal. And they saw it with Trump and they took it. And they basically said, Ralph Reed and others said, no, we don't agree with the guy. He's not our pope, but he gets us what we want and what we've always wanted. Is that the fear you have as a secularist of what will happen to religion and government? Is that they'll basically just make a deal with some particular religious group, and that's what our politics are going to turn into?
I'd be, if I were a conservative Christian myself, I'd be very worried about the future of conservative Christianity in this country, because there's going to be payback, right? I mean, this has been 20 grueling years. In the last 5 years, for all who are not conservative Christians, people notice these things, right? Muslims, Jews notice it, non-believers notice it.
Yeah.
They're developing an enemies list, which is rather long and extensive, and the grievances are justified. Something Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said. He didn't say much about secularism, but I found one interesting aside. He said the church is neither the master nor the servant of the state.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good position for Christian. It's a witness. It's a witness.
Yeah.
It's saying, no, don't do that, right? But never should the church, according to Dr. King, dictate to the state, which is precisely what your example about Donald Trump showed, right? You're the church dictating who is going to do what and what the policies will be. Never should the church find itself in that position. And I think what Dr. King was saying, because it's bad for the church, it's unchristian, and it's bad for the integrity of the body of Christ, right? To be kind of calling the shots, because that's not what the religion, according to its foundation, demands.
So what? I know we have to cut out here in a minute, but what is the goal as you would see it? Like, obviously you're not you're not a clergy person giving advice to religious people, but as a religious person thinks about their deep faith that they might know and understand, and it frames their own personal edicts and behavior, and they want a world that looks good for everyone. How should someone bring their religion with them when they enter into public spheres and spaces?
Yeah, I like the idea of do no harm, right? Supersizing that, the idea that, you always err on the side of compassion, of generosity, of empathy. To me, those were always Christian values. Where when I grew up, that's what the Christians taught. Right? Judaism and Islam were a little different, right? They had those values, but they had other values. What I always thought was kind of neat about Christianity, as I understood that, was that love for the world, that love for people that weren't nice to you, that concern for all others. So I think the bones of Christianity, if you will, are really solid, right? And there's some very, very solid moral teaching there. I guess it's the job of pastors and clergy such as yourself to remind your co-religionists that this is what we're about. We're the love people, right? We're the empathy people. We're the compassion people. That's what one should bring into public service.
Wow, that's a great table tennis return right there. I tried to knock that one over to you to say, what would you say to these people? And well done. You put it back on all of us. Yeah. I heard someone say that a lot of Christians used to worry, 10 years ago, that people in the rest of the country didn't believe what Christians believed, and they were bothered by that. Now the critique is, well, you as Christians don't believe what you say you believe. Like, that's the problem. It's not that we're worried about if we agree with you. You don't agree with yourself. Our producer here is also a musician and wrote a song called the hymn for the 81%, which is a reference to the 81% of evangelicals that supported Donald Trump in 2020. And it's got this great line in it where he says, Dan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but why don't you live the words that you put in my mouth? Like, what happened? Why has this gone to just bloody knuckles, both metaphorically and literally, where Christian groups are the ones funding all of this political violence? Like, it's really nutty. And I know that, sometimes religious people get too obsessed about their own reputation, and I'm trying not to do that. I don't think it's really about, does it look good on the church or not? It's just trying to show people that this isn't working well, and that secularism is something that has to be worked for, and probably should be. I think, I've argued that because I didn't grow up religious. I didn't grow up in a religious tradition. I got into it as a young adult. And so every time people talk about that other kind of world out there, I'm like, that was me and my family and all the people like that. That it's that idea that you have a sensitivity to the other and to the left out and the left behind and the let down. That's the thing you're really fundamentally called to. that's sort of lost in this last 30 or 40 years of American popular culturalism. Well, Professor, thank you. This is going on and on there at the end, but this has really been great. Do you get out and about? Do you travel around? If people are like, I want that guy to come on my podcast or come to my town, or
I'd love to. I love coming to American towns, right? But I do. If you go to my web page, I write about a lot of subjects, and right now I'm writing
okay,
about African American Jewish American relationships, which is why I'm reading so much of Dr. Martin Luther King's work. So if you go to my webpage, jberlinerblau.com, you can see a lot of the op-eds I write. I've just written about the Whoopi Goldberg controversy. I write about secularism. I write about fiction. I'm an old school professor. I write about a whole bunch of things.
Can we continue to invite you to come on when we read one of those pieces that you've got? All right, because I'd love to have you on to talk about the Whoopi Goldberg thing. If people don't know, her comments about the Holocaust was that wasn't racial. That was white people killing other white people. That's not a minority opinion. There's a lot of people who think that and have said that kind of things, and it's, I don't know, very difficult to comprehend.
I would love to come on with my colleague, Professor Terrence Johnson. We co-wrote this book together. And I'm sure he would adore, as a person who feels that theology needs a larger role in public life, he would adore being on this show talking about these. So we'll hook each other up.
Stay in touch, and we will do that. We'll do that. Thank you. So good to talk with you today.
Sure.
All right. Okay. Bye-bye. Well, that was a good day, huh? Good day around the old shop. Bye.
Gotta run, everyone.
I'll just you go take care of all things.
All right, bye.
Well, Dan, that was pretty great, huh? That was a doozy of a conversation. We had a little friends, just to give you a little insight. So we had a little glitch in our system, and we started late today, but I'm sure glad we did it because, man, that was right on point.
Yeah, that was good stuff.
Hi, sorry about that. Yeah, I didn't tell you were going to come on here, did I? Hey, have you cleaned up your background?
I didn't do my hair.
Is that piano new back there? What's going on?
That's an organ. It's and I haven't cleaned up, but I've added more junk in the background. Just
I love it.
Getting wild in the studio.
For frequent viewers, that if they can, tell us about a change that we've made from one week to the next, like what's this week's change? That would be a fun little game.
I need to get a little live on air sign like you have in the background. Because
hey, I know a guy in Poland you can order one from. It'll get here by May, so that's not a bad deal. The on-air one's nice. The live one is, a little more fluorescent. When I turn that other one on, it lights up. Because of the way my background is, you can't read it. But boy, didn't you think that secularism was an interesting conversation to have?
Yeah, I loved that. And I loved discovering that the roots of secularism are from Christian thinkers. Like, that's not a connection I would have made.
Yeah, and the idea, I mean, especially, when you think about it, you're like, yeah, of course, in the founding of this country. And it's hard to remember that Luther, even Calvin, had just the worst ideas in my view about how to make, by making a religious, community in Denmark is just terrible. But they were really struggling as minority groups because, Luther was a break off from the dominant Catholic Church. Like all of them, Calvinism was a break off from Christianity as a whole. So all of these were the minorities, and like, Jacques said, when you're in the minority, you really want this thing to not be dominated by religious majorities.
That's what's strange about the climate we're in now is like we've celebrated religious freedom for so long, and now when Republicans say religious freedom, a lot of times they mean the opposite. They mean Christianity should be allowed and all other things should take a back seat. Because you talk about like, let's bring God back to schools. We need to get God in schools. And then you throw the idea of like a Muslim prayer time in school. And it's like, well, we didn't mean that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is a raging debate. I'm listening to a new podcast that's come out from Serial that's all about that. And that's a raging debate here where I live in Minneapolis, because it is because there's a number of charter schools, which are public schools, but are set up for a particular subset of students. And some of those are predominantly Somali kids. So they have, prayer time for Muslim Somali kids.
Mm-hmm.
And when I talk to conservative Christians about prayer in school, I'm like, yeah, it should. I mean, that's why we should support those charter schools. They just literally say, no, it should be a default that Christianity is the thing, and look, that's been, I've been surprised to know that in England, they have mandatory religious time in schools built into it's required. And the default in England is that it's Christian, and you can petition as a school to have it not be Christian.
Huh.
It's unbelievable. So a lot of, and here in the United States, that, even having a time for quiet meditation sometimes gets put under scrutiny and all the rest.
But there are more people saying the quiet part out loud, which is like, no, we don't mean religious freedom. We mean that America is a Christian nation.
Yes.
And that's where you get this whole rise of Christian nationalism that aren't even playing anymore, like religious freedom is good.
No,
I'm trying to remember the pastor that literally just came out and said during a sermon, religious freedom is bad for Christianity. Like in a sermon, he's like, no, we don't want religious freedom because then the competition increases. Like you get, he said this to, his congregation.
Yeah. But, the thing I appreciate about Jacques' work on this and writing this book and putting it out, even though it's clearly not the only thing he wants to talk about, is to be reminded that this has been the American struggle all along, right? And figuring this out, whether it's Jefferson and Madison disagreeing or Washington disagreeing or other, people who followed them the next generation were like, oh, those guys really, fumbled the ball, that we've never gotten it just right. It's a project to continue to work on. And I think I wish I'd asked this to the professor, because that approach to say, we're still have to work on this, neither side, either the like hyper secular or hyper religious side, thinks it's something we're supposed to be working on. They're just like, it's clear that this is how it should be, and we need to enact that now. As opposed to, boy, this is learning to walk on a daily basis. Like we're having to structure this as we go and figure out if this is really how a society can and should function.
Yeah. There's a phrase from the evangelical world. I forget what pastor author said it, but this is a tension we have to live with. Like it's not, if you cut the string and go one direction or the other, it's a disaster. And so we have to figure out this balance between the two.
Well, as a new guitarist, I will say, when you tune that guitar, what you are doing is tuning that tension. When there's no tension in a guitar string, it's called broken, and it's no longer a guitar string, right? It's a piece of nylon or metal or whatever it is. It only does its function when there is that tension, when there is that pull from both sides. Yeah. So it seems like
you need the tension to make beautiful music. I feel like there's a whole very bad sermon tied up in there.
I love it. And I would say having the right tension and the right tune still doesn't give you beautiful music. It still sounds like a monkey banging on a guitar when a guy is just trying to strum the C chord. It's unbelievable. There is a skill to the music, but without the tension, you're never going to get it. So we need both the musician and the tension. And actually, I'm not even sure every individual should spend their time worrying about secularism, right? Like it's kind of, I don't know. I don't think it's just everybody's struggle to figure out because it's hard and it's complicated, and not everybody wants to fuss with it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thanks to everyone in the chat. Mike says, how do we convince good religious people that these extremists in America are bad for everybody? I think that's a great question we're trying to figure out and do work around, is how do we appeal to the values that people claim they have to say this is not going well for anyone.
Yes. Yeah. Good. I mean, just basically getting back to the notion of good news, that it's actually perceived as good, and that it's news, and that it's something that people say, yeah, it's not sort of bad repetition. It's supposed to be something that rings true,
Yeah.
rings good. So vote common good news, I guess. All right. Hey, we'll talk to you tomorrow where we're talking about other important things that I can't remember what they are right now, but
very important. Tune in.
We will remember in the morning. All right. See ya.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. All right. I'll shoot you this over. I got to go jump on a.
We're still live
Zoom
because
call.
somehow my mouse disappeared.
You can't make it stop?
I can't. Where'd it go?
What if I just hang up and just leave you literally hanging?
Literally, I was moving to click the button, and now I have no mouse. Well, this is great.
I'm hanging up. Bye.
Well, hey, everyone. Thanks for hanging with me through these awkward technical difficulties. Might just have to pull the power. There we go.